Since the start of this crisis, there have been mixed messages from the government about travel restrictions in and out of the UK. 2 weeks ago, with reports passengers would be quarantined, here was the Foreign Secretary.
The advice that we got, and I checked it with the scientist, the chief medical officer, at the outset when we took our social distancing measures, is it wouldn't make any difference from a public health point of view.
But today, new reports confirmed by the aviation industry that from the 1st of June, anyone arriving into the UK will have to self-isolate for 14 days. So what's changed and why? The Transport Secretary today suggested the science now backs plans to quarantine new arrivals.
We now have the capacity, as we just discussed, in testing as well. It clearly then makes sense to look at what happens at the borders. I can't confirm is the answer. We'll have to wait for the Prime Minister tomorrow night, Ben, but it does mean that the capacity to do those things exists, but also that the science would back it as well.
Since the pandemic took hold, while the UK only issued travel advice, more than 140 countries across the world imposed travel restrictions. Italy and Greece forcing arrivals to self-isolate for 14 days. Spain and France went further, allowing entry only to its citizens and long-term residents. A former director of the WHO says we are finally falling into line with other countries as the government struggles to keep down new infections and deaths.
We're not following the science for find, test, trace and isolate. And it would seem we're not following other countries on isolation and quarantine of imported cases. So we need to get our whole strategy clear.
Even if the government's strategy is now perhaps becoming clearer, what will this mean for the great British summer getaway? Many fear quarantine could spell an end to their plans.
I was seeing plenty of signs that countries were getting ready to restart their tourism industries on which they so critically depend, particularly places such as Greece and Portugal. But that is all now going to be called off. And as the airlines wonder if they've got any future whatsoever, you can almost hear the cheers from Paris, from Frankfurt, from Dubai, with the airports and the airlines there thinking, crikey, the British government has decided completely to scupper its airlines.
Passenger numbers have already declined by 98% since the start of the crisis, and this will see even fewer flights in the skies. Airlines have already made tens of thousands of people redundant.
Aviation's a key driver for the UK economy. We employ more than 1 million people. We contribute £1 billion a week in terms of GDP. But we're also really important facilitators for other businesses like tourism, like trade and cargo in and out, high-tech manufacturing, all of those industries which rely on us being, providing an effective service.
All eyes tomorrow on the Prime Minister and his televised address. Businesses looking for reassurance, and the public too, with everyone hoping to see a clear strategy both in combating the virus and unlocking the lockdown.
Well, joining us now is Davies, Ritter, Professor of Global Public Health at Edinburgh University. Is it a case of the 2-week quarantine being better late than never, or what's your view on that?
Well, definitely. I think right now we need to use the lockdown time to put in place measures that can help contain this virus. And it's a whole package of measures that are needed from a public health perspective. And one of those is indeed watching the risk of importation of cases. And so putting in place and making sure that imported cases don't set off a whole new set of clusters.
But you heard in Inigo's piece there the concerns of the aviation industry. Isn't there a danger of trashing the economy to protect people from a disease which for the vast majority is relatively mild?
Well, I think the thing to first say about this disease is that while we do tend to fixate on the death numbers, there are, also a substantial number of people who will get this and recover, but still face a long time of actually having impacts on their lungs, their heart, on their brain. And so we shouldn't underestimate actually the severity of this virus and the impact it can have on people. Coming to the point about the aviation industry, I mean, I think the thing to say and what we've learned so far is the earlier you move and contain this virus, it's good for public health, but it's also good for the economy. The best thing right now is for us to get a good handle on this so that actually we're in a position to start releasing restrictions and actually getting economic activity back up again.
But should this quarantine measure have happened right at the start of the crisis? I mean, they did quarantine people from Wuhan, but much more broadly, as other countries did.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I think, the two lessons that we've learned so far is first that actually travel bans to specific countries aren't that effective. So if you're just trying to quarantine from China or Italy, you're actually going to miss a substantial number of people. So either you have to make a decision that everybody's quarantined or nobody's quarantined, especially as the outbreak progressed and we saw it emerging in so many different countries. But yes, I mean, it's clear that definitely, at least in March, if we look at actually the UK is now one of the few countries that has actually no restrictions in place. Most countries have moved in that direction.
We're going to see the shape of the easing of lockdown tomorrow from the Prime Minister. But in your view, would you advise, for example, schools to be kept closed throughout the summer? Is there going to be some sort of social distancing, some sort of lockdown right into the autumn? What's your view?
Well, I think what we're going to see is phased reopening, and early findings seem to show that this virus transmits less well outdoors. And so actually, when you're looking at where you can release restrictions, things that happen outdoors seem easier to release and hopefully more safely, and we have to monitor them. With kids, I think we're missing two important pieces of information. One is actually what is happening with this small number of children who seem to be developing a severe immune reaction to the coronavirus several weeks after exposure. So we really need to get clarity on that. We're seeing that in the UK, but also now emerging cases in New York. And the second thing is actually what is the degree to which children transmit to adults? We know in general children have very mild symptoms on the whole, but actually how can they actually transmit to adults? To what degree? How safe are teachers and parents going to be if children are circulating again? I think if we get answers to these questions, then we can open schools even sooner than the fall.
But just briefly, if we don't get answers to those questions, the schools should stay closed for the foreseeable future, even primary schools.
Well, I think until we get actually a test, trace, isolate strategy in place and surveillance to know who actually has the virus, we need to keep schools closed for the immediate future.
Davies, thank you very much for joining us. Well, with just 24 hours until the Prime Minister sets out his revised lockdown strategy, sun worshippers in the capital have seemingly been struggling to stick to the current rules. Hackney police said in a tweet they were fighting a losing battle in the parks today. So what would the public across the country like to hear from the Prime Minister tomorrow, and how are businesses coping while the lockdown restrictions remain in place? Our Home Affairs correspondent Andy Davies has spent the day in Weston-super-Mare on the Somerset coast. Andy.
Kathy, early on in this lockdown, the tourist board here changed its name from Visit Weston to Don't Visit Weston, trying to reinforce that stay-at-home message. I think it's fair to say that here, as in other parts of the UK, it feels like there are more people out and about. Many we spoke to content to keep the core elements of the lockdown in place, but others, particularly those reliant on tourism, increasingly concerned about what the future holds for their businesses. From this angle, Weston-super-Mare's promenade looked busy enough this morning. All those we spoke to were residents taking their daily exercise. But with the pier closed, donkey rides absent, and beach largely empty on such an inviting day, is the hit on the local economy here changing attitudes to the lockdown? What we asked, did they hope to hear when Boris Johnson tomorrow outlines what next for restrictions in England?
Keep social distancing, but we would like to go a little bit farther away,
Further afield, yeah.
Farther afield, We would then, when we get to the destination, we would still social distance, but we feel a little bit trapped in Weston at the moment,
I don't know. I suppose a bit of clarity as to when all this is going to end. That would be good.
What do you want to hear from the Prime Minister tomorrow for England?
That it keeps going, that it stays as it is. No change.
Guidance from scientists. That's all I want. I want him to follow what they're suggesting.
I'd like to stop the social distancing. It's really driving me mad, really.
But there's a very good reason.
Yeah, I know there's a very good reason, and it helps the NHS by keeping your distance. I realise that, but it does get to you after a time.
Over what time frame would you like to see that?
Well, a slow time frame, I think.
In Victorian times, Weston-super-Mare thrived on its reputation as a health spa resort. Its health concerns now keeping the latest generation of visitors away. On a bank holiday weekend, you would be packed, presumably.
I normally have 10 tables outside and 8 tables here.
140 for lunch is what Chris Dimitriou and his family would normally get on a day like this. If permitted in the future, I ask, could they open with social distancing measures?
It would be very difficult, very difficult. How do you keep people away from each other? How about the staff? How are they going to cope from one table to another table? We'll try not to think about it this year. We'll try not to think about it. Yeah. Yes, there is a lot of worse cases than us. You are talking about business and money now. People are burying people. People are chasing families and relatives in hospitals. So, as I said, money is not everything this time.
At a nearby barber's, Kevin Sampson shows us the face mask and visor he's waiting to use as soon as allowed.
And that is pretty warm. I tried it for 5 minutes the other day, just wearing it around the house, and it was really hot. My glasses steamed up, so it's going to be tricky. Probably a string vest.
But you're willing to do it?
Yeah, I've got to. You've got to make money if you're going to survive. No.
But few expect businesses like his to reopen imminently, nor hotels like Nicky Slade's. It's 55 rooms heavily reliant on fully booked coach tours. What would you like to hear from the Prime Minister tomorrow?
Well, I'd like to know some guidelines. What we can do, how long before we can open. Can we have a bar? We can't have a bar. We've realised from tour operators that we're not going to be able to take 50 on a coach anymore. We'll probably be half, because they won't be able to get here because of the seating. We understand that we've got to be safe, but obviously for us, we need to get people through the door.
That is likely to be some time off yet, as the UK government says people in England should not expect any dramatic changes to be announced tomorrow.
Well, Andy, there's a beautiful view behind you of Wales, and of course restrictions there have just been changed. What can we learn from what the Welsh First Minister has said from what Boris Johnson might say in England?
I think it's worth reiterating that these lockdown rules are being determined by 4 administrations, not one. However, Mark Drakeford, the First Minister of Wales, has said that he thinks it's likely that any changes in England are likely to be in line with what he's announced will come into place from next week for Wales, and that involves allowing people to exercise outdoors more than once, allowing garden centres to open if they can socially distance properly. Northern Ireland has said that any changes there would be minor, while in Scotland the only change they're considering involves guidance surrounding outdoor exercise, and that's because in these parts of the UK I've mentioned the reproduction rate of the virus, so-called, is considered too high to countenance any significant changes. And you only have to look at the social media accounts of health workers this weekend, aghast at some of the gatherings they've witnessed outside, to see that they think any changes, meaningful, big, major changes to the lockdown will have a devastating impact at this stage in terms of the health context.
Andy, thanks very much.